Cannabis Cowboys were real, and their story was buried for over a century. The Wild West you know is a lie. Sure, there were shootouts, saloons, and gold, but there was also a secret the history books buried. A green leaf carried by cowboys, outlaws, and revolutionaries. It healed wounds, calmed nerves before duels, and then, almost overnight, it became a crime. This is the untold story of cannabis on the frontier, how it went from medicine to menace, from Pancho Villa's battlefields to outlaw ranches. By the end of this video, you'll never see the Wild West, or cannabis, the same way again. Before we dive in, if you love uncovering the hidden truths of the Old West, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes next will surprise you. Now let's dig into the real story of the Cannabis Cowboys. Early roots: hemp as a colonial staple. Long before cannabis stirred political debates, hemp was simply a necessity of daily life. In the 1600s, colonies like Virginia and Massachusetts even passed laws requiring farmers to grow it. Why? Because hemp was tough, versatile, and vital for survival. It became rope, ship sails, clothing, and even a form of currency. The very first drafts of the U.S. Constitution were written on hemp paper. Founding fathers like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson grew it, not for intoxication, but to support their farms and the economy. The kind of cannabis that causes a high wasn't commonly used in these communities. The focus was on hemp, valued for its industrial uses. As settlers moved westward in search of new opportunities, hemp came with them. It was planted in new frontier towns and integrated into daily living, woven into wagon ropes, stitched into clothing, and stretched across sails. Hemp was a cornerstone of early American life, long before fear or prohibition touched it. It helped build the nation, journeying alongside its people, becoming a quiet yet essential part of the Wild West story.
Medicine on the frontier.
Life on the frontier was brutally tough. Settlers faced harsh weather, exhausting travel, and illness with very little medical support. Doctors were scarce, and many towns didn't have a proper pharmacy. Sometimes the only drugstore was a traveling wagon. People relied on what they could grow, gather, or trade. And cannabis was one of those essential remedies. By the mid-1800s, cannabis had become a common part of American medicine. It wasn't used to get high, it was used to help people feel better. Cannabis was prescribed for sleeplessness, headaches, joint pain, muscle cramps, and menstrual discomfort. The most common form was a tincture, a liquid medicine that was easy to take. Well-known companies like Park Davis and Eli Lilly sold cannabis tinctures in stores. No prescription was required, it was inexpensive, and it was widely trusted. Cowboys nursing injuries or bullet wounds used cannabis for pain relief. Women turned to it during childbirth, when stronger painkillers simply didn't exist. It wasn't viewed as a dangerous drug, it was just another useful plant. Alongside herbs like ginger and mint, cannabis was valued because it was cheap, easy to grow, and genuinely effective for pain. Across the Wild West, it quietly became a staple of home medicine, kept in cupboards and travel satchels, ready whenever sickness or injury struck. This brings us to the moment when cannabis truly met the frontier, and the story begins to change. As America's frontier expanded and mingled with Mexican culture, cannabis took on a new identity. In Mexico, marijuana had already been used recreationally and in spiritual rituals for generations. Mexican workers, cowboys, and soldiers brought these traditions north into the United States, particularly into Texas and the Southwest. This was very different from how most Americans had been using it. In the US, cannabis was usually taken as a liquid tincture, but the Mexican method of smoking it worked faster and was simpler for many. Smoking offered quick relief from pain or stress, making it popular among laborers, especially in border towns, mining camps, and farm communities. As Americans encountered this new way of using cannabis, perceptions began to shift. The plant was no longer seen solely as a clean, respectable medicine in a glass bottle. It became associated with poorer communities and immigrant workers. And for some, prejudice against those groups began to color their view of cannabis itself. This shift in how cannabis was seen also brought with it a growing sense of fear. By the early 1900s, racial tensions were on the rise, and suspicion toward Mexican culture and marijuana spread quickly. Politicians and newspapers began linking cannabis to crime and immorality, often without a shred of real evidence. What had once been a cultural exchange slowly morphed into an excuse for fear, prejudice, and unequal treatment. Cannabis, once respected and trusted, started to be viewed through a much darker lens. The rise of the Cannabis Cowboy. The image of the Cannabis Cowboy began to take shape, part rebel, part healer, part outlaw. In some corners of the Wild West, smoking cannabis became a quiet act of defiance against East Coast authority and heavy-handed government control. It wasn't just a pastime, it was a statement of freedom. These cowboys were nothing like the ones in old Hollywood films. They came from every walk of life. Some were Mexican vaqueros, others black pioneers, native scouts, or white drifters. Many came from hardship and poverty, but they shared two things: resilience and the small green leaf they carried to get them through it. Cannabis eased their nerves before a fight or shootout. It dulled the pain after long days in the saddle or injuries from cattle drives gone wrong. For most, it wasn't about recreation. It was about survival, but those in power didn't see it that way. As the West grew more modern, cannabis became a convenient scapegoat for society's problems. Leaders and the press claimed it caused laziness, violence, and moral decay, regardless of the truth. Rather than recognize its benefits, the wealthy elite and lawmakers turned it into a target. A plant once valued for healing was rebranded as a threat, and its users, especially the poor and non-white, were increasingly treated like criminals for simply using it. A new name, a new perception. In the early 1900s, powerful voices began pushing a new name for the plant: marijuana. This was no casual change. It was a calculated move. The term was chosen to make cannabis sound foreign, suspicious, and dangerous. It tied the plant directly to Mexican immigrants and cultural practices unfamiliar to many Americans. Before this, most people knew it as cannabis, a name still found in medical texts and pharmacy labels. Cannabis sounded clinical and safe. Marijuana sounded strange and threatening. And that was the goal. By changing the name, those in power could more easily stir public fear. Newspapers ran sensational stories of marijuana-mad criminals, despite lacking credible evidence. These exaggerated tales convinced many that the plant was a public menace. The manufactured fear provided the perfect justification for stricter laws and increased policing, particularly in immigrant neighborhoods. A plant that had once soothed pain and eased stress was now a political weapon, used to justify arrests and control over certain communities. No longer just a medicine or part of frontier life, cannabis was painted as a danger to the very fabric of American society. What do you think? Was cannabis outlawed for safety, or was it all about control? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Pancho Villa and the Cannabis Revolution. During the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s, cannabis stepped into a new chapter of history. General Pancho Villa, the legendary Mexican revolutionary, led soldiers who were known to smoke marijuana before battle. They believed it kept them calm, clear-headed, and courageous under fire. But across the border, U.S. newspapers told a very different tale. Sensational headlines warned of marijuana-crazed Mexicans committing acts of violence near the border. These stories stoked fear among Americans, even though they were often wildly exaggerated or outright false. This shift in narrative transformed cannabis in the public eye, from a trusted medicine to a symbol of war, danger, and foreign influence. Many began to believe it sparked madness or violence, but the reality was far from the myth. Villa's men were not criminals. They were rebels fighting against injustice in their own country. Smoking cannabis was part of their cultural tradition, not a tool for harm. Still, those facts meant little to U.S. lawmakers and the press. The fear generated by these stories gave the government a convenient excuse to act. Politicians seized on the false narrative to push for harsher laws, and soon, cannabis was banned in many states. The lies used to justify prohibition didn't fade. They lingered for decades, shaping public perception long after the truth had been buried. Lawlessness and accessibility persisted. Even as the government ramped up its anti-cannabis rhetoric, people in the West kept using it. Vast stretches of open land and small, isolated towns made law enforcement spotty at best. This lack of oversight allowed growers, traders, and sellers to operate without much fear of being caught. During Prohibition, when alcohol was outlawed, some whiskey smugglers began adding cannabis to their shipments. They quickly discovered it could be just as profitable. On remote ranches and quiet farms, the plant was cultivated in secret. The wide, empty landscapes provided perfect cover, and neighbors tended to mind their own business. In true frontier fashion, people made their own rules, and cannabis became part of that independent spirit. In certain towns, sheriffs turned a blind eye to its use, and some even enjoyed it themselves. But change was on the horizon. Newspapers began linking cannabis to things that urban America feared: immigrants, jazz culture, and big city crime. The stories were often exaggerated, but they struck a chord. Cannabis was no longer just a quiet part of life in the West. It had become a topic in Washington, D.C. Federal leaders didn't like what they were hearing in the press and decided it was time to intervene. New rules and outright bans were coming, and the frontier's freedom to use cannabis was about to disappear. The turn toward regulation. The shift came in 1937, when the U.S. government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing cannabis. Leading the push was Harry Anslinger, the powerful head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger relied on fear and racial prejudice to sell his agenda, claiming cannabis caused Black and Mexican men to forget their place and turned white women into so-called drug-crazed lovers. Doctors spoke out, insisting cannabis was both safe and beneficial, but their objections were dismissed. The law passed, cutting off the West's long-standing relationship with the plant. Overnight, cannabis users, from outlaw cowboys to ordinary working people, were transformed into criminals. What had once been a tool for survival became a federal offense. The seeds of stigma. Once cannabis was outlawed, the stigma took root. People who had depended on it for generations were suddenly branded addicts, degenerates, or troublemakers. Communities of color suffered the harshest consequences. Black jazz musicians, Mexican laborers, and native users were targeted and arrested in disproportionate numbers. Lawlessness and easy access. Even with the government's growing hostility toward cannabis, the West didn't stop using it. Expansive open land, small isolated towns, and limited law enforcement made strict policing nearly impossible. This freedom allowed people to keep growing, trading, and selling cannabis with little fear of being caught. During Prohibition, when alcohol was banned, some whiskey smugglers began adding cannabis to their shipments, discovering it was just as profitable. On remote ranches and secluded farms, the plant was quietly cultivated. The vast, empty landscapes hid crops well, and neighbors rarely pried. True to its frontier roots, the Wild West remained a place where people lived by their own rules, and cannabis became a natural part of that way of life. In some towns, local sheriffs turned a blind eye to cannabis use. Some even partook themselves. But gradually, the atmosphere began to change. Newspapers started associating cannabis with everything urban America feared: immigrants, jazz culture, and big city crime. These stories were often exaggerated or entirely fabricated, yet they struck a chord with the public. Cannabis was no longer seen as a quiet part of frontier life. It had entered the national conversation. In Washington, D.C., federal leaders took notice, and they didn't like what the headlines suggested. The decision was made. They would step in. Regulations and outright bans were coming, and the West's long-standing freedom to use cannabis was about to vanish. The turning point. That turning point came in 1937 with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing cannabis across the United States. At the forefront was Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger played on fear and racial prejudice, claiming cannabis caused Black and Mexican men to forget their place and turned white women into supposed drug-crazed lovers. Many doctors pushed back, insisting the plant was safe and beneficial, but their objections were ignored. The law passed, and the West's deep-rooted connection to cannabis was severed. Overnight, self-reliant cowboys and everyday users were recast as federal criminals. What had once been a tool for survival was now punishable by law, from survival to stigma. With cannabis outlawed, stigma quickly spread. People who had long depended on it were suddenly labeled addicts, degenerates, or criminals. The heaviest toll fell on communities of color. Black jazz musicians, Mexican laborers, and native users were disproportionately targeted and arrested. The cannabis story of the West had transformed, from one of resilience and independence to one of fear, persecution, and government control. The outlaw image that once belonged to gunslingers was now stamped onto anyone who dared to use the plant. The same frontier that had built its legacy on freedom and self-reliance was now another battleground for control. This time over a leaf. For decades, the myth stuck. The headlines, the fear, the prejudice, they buried the truth so deeply that most people today have no idea cannabis was once as common on the frontier as coffee or tobacco. But history has a way of resurfacing. And when you uncover it, you start to see that the Wild West wasn't just shaped by gunpowder and gold, it was shaped by the quiet, controversial presence of a plant that healed, calmed, and endured, even in the face of the law. If you think cannabis was the only thing the Wild West authorities lied about, you're in for a shock. Click the video on your screen now to discover the other truth they kept hidden.